Hi, everybody. Just trying to connect my iPad, and we'll get started in just a minute. Well, we'll let it continue to work in the background. Okay, how is everybody? Can you hear me okay? So let's see who we've got on here. We have Andrew, Michelle, Grace. So far, 3. Let me get the right screen shared. Okay, can you see my slides? So, how was it? How was the first week? I actually have a poll, but let me just ask you, since there's only a few of us here today, and you can unmute yourself when you're ready. How did it go? How'd the first week go for you all?
I didn't think it was too bad. I liked the video with the questions. I think that helped me a lot.
Oh, good. So this class went okay for you. How about your other classes?
I'm not really doing anything in my other classes, so it's just like one discussion board, and we haven't really done any Zoom classes. So yeah, it's kind of weird.
Did anybody get caught? Was it 5 hours yesterday that Zoom was down? Did that screw anybody else up? Good. Andrew, Grace, how'd your first week go?
Good. It was pretty easy.
Yeah?
Used to everything.
Yeah. Getting a new, is this anybody's first semester at Cuesta?
No.
Yeah, it's mine.
Grace, did you say it's yours? Okay. Well, welcome. How did your first week go?
It was all right.
You're not convincing me.
All right.
Are you taking, how many other classes are you taking?
So I'm just taking this class and then an English class right now.
Does anybody have an, what do they call, like in-person, face-to-face class? Like I know there's welding and stuff happening.
No.
No. So where are you located? Grace, are you local?
I'm currently stationed in Delaware.
Delaware. So
Yeah.
not even close to local. So
No,
you
not
are,
yet.
so it's like 6 o'clock dinner time at your house.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And are you serving in the military? When you
What's
said
that?
station. Are you serving in the military?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for doing that. Which part?
I'm in the Air Force.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
And Andrew, are you local?
Yeah.
I forget. From where?
Paso Robles.
Paso, that's right. Okay. How's the air quality up there today?
It's better. Blue skies for once.
I'm gonna turn you guys up a little bit because you're a little hard to hear. And Michelle, I forget, you said last week where you're living. Where are you local?
Yeah,
Okay. In SLO or
just Pismo Beach.
Pismo? Very nice. Well, and Grace, are you from California? Are you?
Yeah, I'm from Sacramento.
Okay. Okay. Is your family's home okay up there?
Yeah, so they moved to Pismo. I think they're okay.
Okay.
So,
I know that Sacramento can get kind of close to all the fires. Well, thank you for checking in. I won't do that poll because it's kind of weird to do polls when there's only 3 people. But I do have, like, for the plan for today, and this is, of course, being recorded for people that aren't here. And we have basically, last week, we kind of wet our feet with chapter 1. And I don't know, this is the problem with doing it hybrid like this, where we don't actually, anything that's asynchronous or the problem with people not showing up is we just don't know where the questions are. And so I had planned to, and I still will, ask you all if there's anything in chapter 1 that's went by too fast or you want to chat about further. And then we'll start in the chapter 2 stuff. We won't get through chapter 2 till next week. So we're going to take our time. We're going to start slowing down a little bit. But let me check in with you all and see, is there anything in chapter 1 that you had questions in, or yeah, we did start pretty fast. So anything at all you're curious about? Okay, well, if the questions come up, if you change your mind, just interrupt. And this can be, sort of a discussion. I mean, I do have some stuff to lecture, but today's going to be kind of short. I have to leave at 4 for something else, for another job. So like I said, we'll continue this. And on Thursday, we'll do COVID stuff. So that'll be a day where we just kind of set chapter 2 aside and talk only about COVID. So any questions that any of you have that either are here live or watching at home, bring those on Thursday. And I screwed up I'm trying to figure out when we can meet, more people can meet. And I didn't realize that when I did the Canvas quiz that I would screw myself up by giving people more than one attempt. And so I actually couldn't see people's true answers about where, when they can show up to class, and it wouldn't give me the right report. So anyway, so I'm still trying to figure that out. I'm assuming that this kind of works for you 3 because you're here. Is there, in general, do you think there's a better time for your classmates and you? I'm not trying to ask you to speak for everybody, because I know you can't do that, but is there a more successful time for students for me to offer this face-to-face stuff, do you think?
Probably in the morning, maybe. I don't know.
In the morning?
Like earlier.
I'm all about mornings. I'd love to do mornings. I was doing afternoon because I thought that might be more student friendly, but maybe it's not. Well, we may have to play around with a couple different things and just see what sticks. So anyway, I'll always send that out in the Monday videos. Are you able to see did the video come through yesterday for you all?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Good, well, so let's get started then. So no questions about that other stuff. When we look at, so we kind of pivot, like, so chapter 1, and your discussion that the worksheet that you did over the weekend, or whenever you did it, turned in over the weekend, was about like pros and cons of capitalism. And so that's always interesting, right? Because we have, I think people your age have some very specific views about it. The moment that we're living in history, we have like all sorts of angst about capitalism and questions about capitalism. Or if you're on, depending on how you are raised, it's like socialism's a bad word, or for some of us, capitalism is becoming a bad word, right? So we're left going, well, how should we organize our society? And that's sort of what I was hoping that you would wrestle with a little bit in that discussion. Let me just pause for one more minute and ask the three of you, is there anything that came up for you in that, questions that arose out of the discussion, or anything else that you want to bring up at this point, or just reflect back to me how that went? Was it successful? Was it weird? Did you come up on the side of capitalism, on socialism? I'm fully aware that it's a very big, complex question, so I wasn't trying to make your head explode, but I was trying to get us to dig a little bit deeper. Anybody want to say anything about how it went? Okay, well, I'm going to ask you then to put it out there. If you are brave enough, did any of you vote for pure capitalism? Raise your hand. Anybody vote for pure socialism? Raise your hand. Anybody vote for something in the middle? Michelle, did you vote for something? Did you go anarchy all the way?
Did capitalism.
Capitalism, okay. It's a little dark where you are, I can't totally see. Okay, so we have kind of 2 votes for capitalism, 1 vote for hybrid. That's interesting, and that's great, and that's kind of helps me to know, like, basically where to target the critique, right? Because I think as an economist, I'm always going to say, and I think most economists would say this, we have capitalism is great, except when it's not, right? So we have a love for capitalism, we have critique of capitalism, same thing with socialism. In fact, socialism, a little brief history of socialism, it is invented as a direct critique of capitalism. So socialism came after capitalism. And socialism, as you, I'm sure know, there's a million ways to do it, just like there's a million ways to do capitalism. And we don't need to get hung up on that, except that to be careful that in our day and age, people are collapsing things and oversimplifying. There's only one type of capitalism, and it equals economic and social and whatever freedom. And socialism, there's only one way to do it. We saw how the Soviet Union did it, and they take away freedoms, and it ends up as this authoritarian state. And those are both overly simplistic, right? We have varieties of Gracie voted for sort of a hybrid. We have varieties of capitalism that exist in Europe, right? That are very different than the US. We have varieties of capitalism that exist in Japan that are very different. We have varieties of capitalism that exist in China that are very different, right? They miss democracy. So there's all sorts of different ways to do it. There's heavy-handed socialism, that was the USSR model, and then there's democratic socialism, right? Like a lot of the Scandinavian countries. And so, So anyway, most economists would be like, don't fall in love with anything that's, don't become a fundamentalist. Don't become a market fundamentalist, nor a socialist fundamentalist, right? In fact, most countries and now that we've been doing this for a while, most countries sort of find themselves somewhere in the middle. The US has lots of capitalism and has lots of socialism too. So to call us one or the other, or any country besides maybe North Korea, one or the other is naive. Anyway, does that make sense? Do you have comments, questions, or pushback about that? So if I'm not careful, I'll get into a lecture from my comparative economic systems class. But chapter 1, I think, does a pretty good job of showing you, like, you know, some of the nuances of capitalism, how capitalism can look in different places, and what capitalism is defined as. Okay, so chapter 2 gets into this material about the Adam Smith's self-interest and competition, right? That invisible hand idea, that that honoring my own self-interest is going to serve you, right? That was his massive breakthrough. That and the idea of specialization, this idea that the economy can grow and without anybody ordering it at all, as long as we allow people to follow their self-interest and maintain competition amongst businesses, right? That's the key. That's the second big key. Free market capitalism requires that you have competition. And that's one of the ways, by the way, that modern Western capitalism, especially US capitalism, is violating Adam Smith's original sort of plan for capitalism. Monopolies don't exist. They shouldn't exist in capitalism. They do exist. We know why they exist, right? It's always easier for firms when they don't have to have competition. They can, you know, they can jack up their prices. They don't have to work quite as hard. It's totally predictable and understandable why we have monopolies, but government is supposed to be there to break up the monopolies, to keep it as sort of the purest form of free market capitalism that exists, and we don't have that. So that's one of the violations that the US is starting to get into. We're seeing the size of our firms get really large. We're seeing profits swell even in recession. Not for everybody, but for, you know, especially for large firms. And we're seeing productivity for workers rise, but their wages are not rising. And the best fit argument we have for that, or sort of explanation for that, I would say, is that we have monopolies. Monopolies can do that. They can extract, they can keep wages down, and they can take more profit because there's just fewer firms to work for, right? And as workers, we don't have as many choices, and so that keeps our wages down. I'm getting a little bit into microeconomics and labor market economics, so I don't want to take ourselves too far there, but I want to put that out there, especially for people that are either really fans of capitalism or people that are really harsh critics of capitalism. Know that we're not in the ideal capitalist society to critique it or to champion it. Let me pause there for any questions that we have live or comments at all. Groovy. Okay. So chapter 2 gets us into the juxtaposition, the tension between individual and group, right? So the Adam Smith's invisible hand is kind of self-interest guides you to the Holy Land, right? And even in Adam Smith's day, he was aware that there would be things called market failures, that wasn't always the case. It's true in certain cases, but it's also not true in some cases. All of pollution, all of climate change, all of the mask debate that we have, right, is all about, is that sort of tension of me following my self-interest. It's not always in alignment with your self-interest, right? And so, or the group's self-interest. So if I'm thinking about whether or not to wear a mask, that social dilemma comes into stark contrast. So me following my self-interest, and you, let's say all of us decide that the costs outweigh the benefits of wearing a mask, then none of us wear a mask. And in thinking that, in thinking that we're going to get, have a better outcome by not wearing a mask. Now, however you sit on the mask debate, I'm not asking you to believe a certain way or change your mind, but let's acknowledge that there's pretty good scientific evidence that that masks at least somewhat help stop the spread, right? So if we can agree to that, then we can agree that we have this social dilemma. Each of us are thinking the benefits outweigh the cost of not wearing a mask, or conversely, the costs outweigh the benefits of wearing a mask. So then none of us wear a mask, and what happens is we get bigger spread, right? And as we get a bigger spread, we get either government shutdowns, or a lot of people, now fear rises and people just, like my brother is not, he's not going to work simply because he's afraid of the person that he works for is elderly, and he's afraid of, getting him sick. And so you get these people that are either voluntarily or by government shutdown, widespread enough that the economy sort of goes on pause again. And if that happens long enough, right, we all lose our jobs. And so at the end of the day, if the economy's crashed because of my individual choice, this is a conundrum, right? I thought I was making myself better off by leaving the mask off, and yet here I am in this crap hole of an economy with no income, and it's just, there's nothing necessarily that's going to pull us out of it until we get through the pandemic. So pandemic is a good, like, short-term visual for, I think, what's going on with the social dilemma. Does that kind of sort of make sense? Any questions at all right now? So we want to identify, like, where, we want to do a couple things. We want to identify where capitalism or the invisible hand can be trusted and where it cannot be trusted, right? Where it's better off for policy to take over, or for, people to set up rules instead of just letting people follow self-interest willy-nilly. Okay, so we want to establish where that is, and then we want to establish sort of the framework by which we'll be able to predict that stuff, right? And the framework that we start seeing in chapter 2 is called game theory. Any of you done any game theory before or heard the term? Okay, it's a relatively new branch of math and then econ. It came over into econ, and it's there's a film called A Beautiful Mind about John Nash, one of the maybe fathers of game theory. But basically, it's this conundrum, like, why do we have nuclear arms races, and why do we have climate change, and why do we have, and not just why, right? Because why, we can say, well, the social dilemma, there's these things that we know, specific instances where my self-interest goes against the community's self-interest, and that's going to be a problem. But also, like, let's predict what's going to happen. If we know that there's this conflict, how's it going to end, right? And so this is where we start to look at the science of game theory. Okay, so John von Neumann is about explaining arms races, right? And other things that we can explain with the same framework. And I'll ask you right now for any other examples you might have besides wearing masks, besides climate change, right? Eating healthier. So even like for our own self, we go like, is it beneficial to society if I eat healthier, right? And is it beneficial to my future self? There's all sorts of ways you can think about this idea of, like, action that you take having costs on other people or on your future self, right? If it's eating healthier or eating less healthy, you're going to end up, paying for that down the road. Pollution. Does that kind of sort of make sense? The framework or the realms that we're looking at here? So these are big, hairy problems, right? And I don't think it's too big of a stretch to go like, oh yeah, we probably should care about those problems. We probably should think about how to answer those questions. So, so let's do it, right? Let's begin, let's go down that road. We have an example in Los Angeles. Now this is a solution to the problem. So take a look at the slide. Let's see if we can figure out what the problem is. So if you're a musician, right, and people come to Mariachi Plaza to get work, what kind of a outcome do you want to have as a musician? What's your economic success as a musician? You want a higher price, lower price, more business, less business? It's pretty clear, right? You want more business at a higher price. But when you have these other musicians around also gunning for the same business that has a predictable outcome, right? How do you get the business? You're going to undercut the next guy in price, right? If they put a bid in at this many $100s, you're going to undercut it by $50 or whatever, right? And so you're going to see this race between the providers, the musicians, and what's going to happen is you're going to get a lower price. Nobody's happy, especially because now it's been described like now the reputation is next week. If I'm hiring for a quinceañera and I have heard my friend said she got it for $600. I'm not going to pay more than $600. So now you've like pushed the price down. None of the musicians are happy because they're barely covering their costs. Whatever that price is, right? And it ends up being sort of this situation where none of them wanted to end up here, but in their following their self-interest and trying to get the business before other people did, they got it. They got hurt. Does that make sense? And so solutions. So we're going to talk about the problem more in depth, but it's also worthwhile to think about solutions. I think that's how the human brain works. We are always like thinking about how to get out of the problem. And here's one way for them to get out of the problem is they sort of created not a union, but an agreement, right? A cartel. That's all a drug cartel is, right? Or an oil cartel. They get together. It's a formal group of producers that agree to price or quality or quantity or whatever to try to maximize their combined success. Does that make sense? So, and so this ended up being, a solution is to cartel, right? To get with your groups of other like-minded people who you've been competing against and turn them into sort of an agreement. So far, so good? So then we want to lift that and say, okay, is that the kind of solution? Could we get people to talk to each other and stop climate change or stop the mask, the great mask debate of 2020 or whatever? Like, can we actually get together and go, we're ending up in the place that that's not good for any of us. Let's see if we can, with a little bit of agreement, get to a better place. What do you think? Is that going to work for 330 million Americans or whatever we are now? When the problem is big and when there's a lot of players in play, now you have probably a lot of musicians in Los Angeles, but not 330 million, right? So not so many that they can't get together, or at least have representatives from each group get together and discuss. So this becomes a big problem. The bigger and the more global your pollution, or the more invisible your germs that you're spreading, right? It gets really, really hard because there's so many people involved. It's almost impossible to get them all together and have a sit down and talk about it. So that, unfortunately, that like people spontaneously jumping up with a solution doesn't seem to be happening for our big problems. Okay, So, so the United Mariachi Organization of LA agreed to set up as a cartel. Any questions or any good, like, does this remind you of another example that you've seen in real life? Or do you have questions about what might be applicable? Okay, all right, we'll forge on ahead and then we'll get to some problems that will work together. So, game theory, we've talked about this already. It is thinking about the strategic interaction of me and you, right? Of me and society, you and society. It can be used for predicting business interactions. And that's what this is for. Oligopolists are when you have just a few large firms. Most of the firms in the US are oligopoly firms. They face just a few competitors, or I shouldn't say most of the firms. I should say most of the industries in the US have just a few firms in them. So most of the industries in the US have oligopoly. Not monopoly, not a single seller, and not perfect competition where there's lots and lots of sellers. That was Adam Smith's vision. But they're rather, you know, AT&T, telecommunications, right? Breakfast cereals, oil refineries, dog food. You could probably think of, automobiles. Any other examples of giant American firms that have just a few competitors? Google is almost a monopoly. Apple, those are approaching like actual single seller status, but so far most of what we buy is out of oligopolies. So the oligopolies, notice why that matters is oligopolies are just a few firms, right? And so it's easy for them, like it was kind of easy to get 200 mariachi musicians together. It's going to be even easier if it's just 2 or 3 large breakfast cereal firms. And so I guess let me offer you all this a thought experiment. Do you think that there's a lot of talk between firms? Do you think there's a lot of cooperation between firms in America setting the price, which by the way is illegal? We do have anti-monopoly or antitrust laws that say specifically that you cannot make an agreement with another seller about the price. You cannot make a minimum price or whatever, set a price with somebody else. Price fixing it's called, is illegal. Do you think it happens? Absolutely, right? It's very easy to do, especially in this day and age, and it's hugely profitable and it's easy. So we think firms are doing this all the time. Firms are, it's really hard to catch them at it, but we think they're doing it. So this tension of like, one of the solutions for this tension between individuals is you know, become a cartel. Get in touch with other, the people you're competing against. And so it happens. But let's get back to our big problems, because problems like climate change and whatnot are not going to be solved that way. There's too many of us. This is a look at why we have, I don't know if this bothers anybody else, but it does seem to be this, right? I saw today an email about, it wasn't a pumpkin spice latte, but it was a pumpkin something, right? So we're not even out of August yet, and pumpkin spice latte season is almost upon us. So what's that about? It's kind of like Christmas is getting earlier and earlier too. These firms are competing against each other. You know, if they can't, so one of the interesting asides is that if you can't directly compete on price, like if you Coke and Pepsi, we've observed this, they don't ever put their stuff on sale in the same week. They've sort of agreed to keep the price high and stable. So how do they compete? They still, it's not like they're BFFs, right? It's not like they're hanging out at parties and stuff. They're still competing with each other, but they're doing it in a different way. They're doing it by better advertising, or they're doing it by whatever, right? Or they're spending money on lobbyists. That's increasingly what's happening, right? Is you spend that money trying to protect your market in other ways, by maybe laws against foreign competition, or other sort of laws that are friendly to you. Okay, so Christmas in October, if you were this would be something you would be able to do. You would have to do perhaps if you were competing against a firm with which you had already set your price. And anyway, it's one of the things we see, like these. It's kind of like a nuclear arms race, but on much less sinister and much less dangerous. But it's like competing to death by putting your ads out earlier and earlier. Anyway, that's a little aside, but any questions about that or comments? So, bringing back a couple of things from chapter 1 that matter for this, just little reminders. And let me ask if any of you have questions about these terms. Institutions, right, are key. So institutions, we mean not just buildings, but like institutions. The IRS is an institution. Our educational system is an institution. The way that we protect private property and contract law, these are all institutions, right? So institutions, how we have set up the rules of the game, in a sense, matter for everything. So they're going to matter for this stuff as well, right? So self-interest, we talked about that already. External effects, that's like, let's tag that. We saw that in chapter 1, but let's bring it back. Is that idea that when I don't wear a mask, there's costs that are potentially borne by somebody else, external to the transaction. Or if I smoke a cigar and somebody breathes in the smoke, although they've not taken part in the purchase or the consumption of the cigar, they still pay some of the costs. That's where a lot of pollution is. External, negative externalities, we call them. Okay, so we're kind of still bringing back a lot of topics here. Ready to jump in just on the game theory now? Sort of setting the stage and getting into game theory. And we're only doing part of chapter 2, not even half. But let's go forward. And if we need to slow down and spend more time on this, we will spend more time on chapter 2 next week, but I am interested to know what, we need to slow down before then. Okay, so when self-interest works, when it doesn't. Here is a social dilemma. We've sort of been talking around the outside about these things, but let's be super clear about what a social dilemma is. That is the mask dilemma, right? If so few of us wear a mask that we crash the economy, we've reached a socially suboptimal outcome. Nobody wants a crap economy that has no jobs for anybody, right? Most of all, I would think young people, right? The cost to you is the highest. In fact, if we, I don't want to bum you out, but hopefully this is the V-shaped recession. Have you heard that term? Where we hopefully, drops, but then it comes back fairly fast. We don't want a, flat, never coming out of it kind of a thing. V-shaped recoveries are not as bad for job prospects for young people, but the longer it lasts, the less, unfortunately, the more harm is done. You get lower and lower pay as this thing drags on. Less and less opportunities become available. It's harder to pull out of. People's skills, what do they call it? Atrophy. Like, you have to relearn how to do certain things because you've been out of practice for a long time. So nobody wants that, but we may be heading there, right? We may be heading there if we can't get our COVID under control. And so one of the tasks of public policies is to address those social dilemmas. So in these are some of the cases where the market fails and somebody else has to step in. All right, so did you read and or understand The Tragedy of the Commons? In grad school, I lived with two or three, I can't remember, other grad students, not to stereotype, but they were men. And there was, not that this doesn't happen with women too, but there was, at least back in the 90s, not really an expectation that they would be doing a whole lot of the dishes. So we always had dirty dishes and dirty house and all of those things, right? And maybe in your house, maybe with your roommates, or maybe just at the house you're living in, I can't think of any houses where this works really well. And so if you're listening to this and your house works really well, send me a remind text or an email and let me know how you figured it out. Because it seems like when we live with other people, there's always fights about who's going to scrub the toilet, who's going to feed the dog, who's going to whatever, right? Anybody want to comment on that? Is that anybody here found a way out of that problem? It's the tragedy of the commons. We all live it every day, right? When we can pollute into a common pool, we do, right? If it's not owned by anybody, it's not clear whose job it is. But also, we're all self-interested, and we all don't, not to say that we don't value each other, but we take each other for granted, and we fail to see the little bit of harm that our dirty dish or whatever leaves for other people. And so when we're considering our own benefits and costs, like nobody wants to live in a house that's covered in mold, and yet our behavior is going to end us up in a house covered in mold, right? Does that make sense? So it's this problem of free riding. We sort of hope that somebody else will do the dishes in time. We in the actual tragedy of the commons that Hardin wrote, people overgrazed land with their cattle because they're thinking about, their own costs and benefits. And it makes sense to graze your cattle as long as there's like 2 blades of grass left. It makes sense to do it. But if everybody behaves that way, the grass is gone, you're left with a dust bowl. And no, that's not sustainable. Nobody wants, now all the cattle are going to starve to death, right? It's the same problem with overfishing of tuna in the water, bluefin tuna in the ocean. They migrate far enough that it's not clear which country's waters they're in, so nobody can really protect them. There's lots of fishing boats that, bluefin tuna catch a lot of revenue. So it's difficult to see how that population, how that particular species is going to last. Better technology, better fishing boats that can find them easier. So that's the common pool problem, or the tragedy of the commons. It's not that any of us did anything morally wrong. Economics has nothing to say about the morals of anybody. In fact, it's completely predictable, and understanding it and not making any moral judgments, I think, is key. Because if you keep it at the level of well, they should just be less greedy, or they should just not take the last tuna. There's some story about some Roman emperor that did exactly this. There was some herb that was used in, Roman cooking that was super tasty and everybody loved it, but it was really hard to grow, and it was only found in certain sandy areas. So basically, people just picked it until it was almost gone. And so this Roman emperor got the very last one, and he set out a feast and had everybody watch him eat the very last of this herb, because that's how he got his jollies or whatever. So making it not a moral thing, we could all be mad at that, because I don't know if that thing was delicious. Maybe it was. So we could be mad at him for robbing future generations of that deliciousness, but that's not going to solve the problem. To solve the problem, you got to get down and dirty with a mechanism of why it happens, and how and that can lead the way to the solution. In fact, with fishing, that's exactly what's happened, right? We've seen fish. Unfortunately, the bluefin migrates too far, but other fish that kind of stay close to a coast, countries have started these tradable fishing permits. The same thing that we've had actually for, in the US, we've had for acid rain. so sulfur dioxide that creates acid rain. We began trading the right to produce acid rain basically in 1990, and that cut it way down. When you trade like permits, when people are allowed to buy and sell and trade permits to fish, that's been one thing that protects fish populations as well. So there are solutions, but they're usually, from the economists, they're not usually about like trying to get people to be less greedy. It's more about trying to create incentives that align their self-interest with sustainability or whatever. Does that make any sense? Am I going too fast? Should I have more picture slides here? Okay, so it's the tragedy of the commons problem. A root cause is that people don't own something, right? There's an old photo I have of, anybody eat tuna? Do you know Chicken of the Sea brand tuna? It's like the old school famous, maybe it's still the most famous sort of canned tuna brand. And Chicken of the Sea, that's an endangered, like bluefin tuna, especially an endangered species. I don't think they use bluefin tuna in the canned tuna. It's mostly for sushi, but there's no, so tuna is endangered, but chickens are not. So Chicken of the Sea is endangered, but chickens on land are not. What's the difference? You can own chickens, right? You can't, chickens don't migrate across thousands of miles. Let's all pause and get that image in our mind. So they don't migrate across thousands of miles, and so they're protected. People can own them and therefore protect them, right? So that's why you have fish farms. Bluefin tuna are too big for fish farms, but salmon can be protected that way, etc. Okay, any questions or comments? So that's kind of the context of the problem, and the issue, right, is that so did you understand, or did you like the little story about who will bell the cat? In chapter 2, you have this, this is a really nice way to think about it. The mice would all be better off if somebody were to put a bell around the cat's neck, but the one mouse that does it is incurring a huge cost. That's kind of like the question of climate change. Whoever sort of starts the ball rolling with carbon dioxide reduction or whatever, or plastic reduction, if you want to talk about another form of pollution, might bear a bigger cost, but it benefits the rest of the world. So it's interesting. And in the pandemic, I think specifically, it's interesting to watch who volunteers to step up to be the cat beller, to be the person that takes risks to help. We've talked about essential workers and first line medical workers, etc. And certainly there's stories of heroism there. But anyway, so it's understandable. Like, I think we want to frame it as it's understandable to follow your self-interest and not take action, or to overfish, or to not do the dishes, whatever. We've been putting together a couple of different sort of examples here. But that's not true for everybody. Sometimes we have people that are extraordinarily selfless. And we could say that could be down to a lot of different things, right? Again, in economics, we're not about making moral judgments, but we want to know why they do that, right? And how we can perhaps we can encourage others to do that. The term that is used for actions that benefit others, even maybe at personal cost, is pro-social. So pro-social things, if you think that COVID is a real thing and that wearing a mask does provide protection for other people, a pro-social thing that you're doing could be choosing to wear a mask, right? Does that make sense? So you're incurring a cost for others, and maybe you're sending a signal to another that you care about their well-being or whatever. You know, there's all different ways we can read it. Okay, so who bells the cat? It's going to be hard, right? We want to, so in the absence of a hero mouse to do it, we need to figure out the solution, right? So it may be that there's government solutions. So I can tell that I think we're not probably going to want to jump too far into game theory. So I will save that for Thursday. But I want to talk, since we're talking about the big problem and some of the solutions, we talked already about these tradable fishing permits. Are any of you fishers? Fish? Do you go fishing? Andrew? Do you do it out or do you do it from the shore?
I usually do it from the shore, yeah, like a dock or something.
Okay, but ocean fishing
Yeah.
or lake?
I do both.
Okay.
Mostly like lake, yeah.
Okay, so do you know if there are, do you ever have like, you have to do a fishing license and all that stuff?
Yeah, I don't have
Yeah.
one right now, but I did, yeah.
Okay. There's this guy, I teach some classes at the gym, and there's this guy that runs a fishing boat, and he was talking about how expensive it is for I guess it's maybe a boat has to have a license too or something. I'm not sure. He's an ocean fisherman. Yeah, is it expensive to get a fishing license, or was it expensive when you did it?
It's not too expensive, honestly. It's like $20, I'm pretty sure.
And that's for a whole season?
Yeah.
And does it give you a limit on the pounds or the number, or how do they count the fish?
They usually give you a limit on the poles you could have on you.
Poles, okay.
Yeah.
So you could stay out all 24/7
Yeah.
with whatever allowed poles you have? Okay.
Yeah, so it's usually like if you get like, you can like get a license, like different license to have like more poles on you. So if you could like bring 3 poles with you, you have to have a certain license for that. I don't know, it's weird.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I guess it's easier to count poles and harder to hide poles if somebody's walking around observing than the number of fish. So that's about a quota, right? So they're actually not giving you a quota on the number of fish, but they're kind of by proxy, they're going, well, Andrew's only got 3 poles. He's not going to probably pull in more than whatever, 40 rock cod or something. Is that something you ever fish for?
Yeah, I actually did catch some rock cod like a few weeks ago.
Nice.
Yeah.
Are they red?
Yeah, they're like a reddish color.
Okay. We were at the Avila Beach at the, what's that last? Old Port Inn?
Yeah, that's where I caught it, yeah.
Up here. Okay. Yeah, there was a kid holding one of those. I'm like, I don't know what that is, but it was like maybe this big, kind of fat and reddish. I think that's a rock cod. Cool. So, yeah, there was probably like 30 people out on Sunday fishing. A lot. So anyway, fishing quotas are a good example of that. We're starting to get more creative with those kind of things. And as fish populations dwindle, you can reduce your quota to keep their numbers sustainable. There's all sorts of, so in California, you may or may not know that our water rights issues, riparian water rights and whatnot, we have some really old, antiquated, weird ways that we deal with water. And in the Central Valley, or in the Valley especially, there's fights over water a lot. They get very cheap water from government, right? There's a lot of farm subsidies in general in the US to different, not across the board, they're not consistent, but there's like specific cotton farmers, for example, get like $100,000 per year at least from the government. So it depends on the lobbying power, it depends on, timing, it depends on all sorts of things, but water rights are an interesting one too, because that's obviously a common pool problem. My parents live out on some land east of Cayucas, and they've seen people move in and start to grow blueberries, which should not be growing here. Blueberries are like Oregon and Maine, and if that tells you anything about what the climate that blueberries prefer. So they're sucking they and then all the wineries that have popped up in the last 20 years are sucking so much of the groundwater up. We get seawater incursion into wells and aquifers, and there's some very real problems with water coming up for the world probably. And so figuring out, if any of you are interested in water rights, that's a huge economic issue, but you're seeing sort of exactly where the issues are, and then in doing so, I think without morals, you can sort of see where the solutions are. So water rights, not a new problem by any means for humanity. We've, in Valencia, Spain, they have been using water courts, which are not sanctioned by the government. They're just, these communities figured them out long ago and they still use them. There's no binding law, but it's a way that they've maintained. The first woman that won the Nobel Prize in Economics, Elinor Ostrom, she passed away recently. She was very interested in like what exactly this problem, like, all right, if you have tragedy of the commons, how have societies worked it out over time? And it turns out there's a lot more examples of like this water court tribunal in Spain than you'd think. So lest we think that we always have to wait for the government to solve everything, that's not necessarily true. But again, it gets back to that problem of small. You have to have a small enough number of people that they can actually like meet in one room or meet over a Zoom call or whatever. I'm kind of glad, well, our class is small, it's like 37, 35. We can handle a lot more than 4 people on the Zoom call. So it would be better if we had more people. But in my poly class, I have 230, and I'm thinking, there's no way for us all to have a conversation on Zoom, right? There's just not. And so like the problem scales up pretty darn fast. As soon as you get, bigger than, I don't know, 40 people, all hell breaks loose. And same with these common pool problems, or these tragedy of the commons, so to speak. There's one thing that we skipped over that I want to make sure that we don't have questions about, which is this free writing. Anybody not understand that term? So my roommates, let's say my roommate, this is awful, I can't remember their names. Well, that's all right. My roommate, Dale, free wrote on my doing the dishes, right? Or maybe you've been in a group like where one person does all the work, like a project group or something for school, and the other people just free ride. That's a real problem, right? So that's what you call the person that's slacking off. You call them a free rider. Does that make sense? Any questions? They're riding on the work of others. All these mice that aren't the cat beller, are the free riders, right? They get the benefit of another's risk. So public policies, government, right? Number 2 is government public policies. Number 3 is those like community initiatives, water courts, etc. There's humans are resilient and smart, right? We actually give us enough time and get us away from playing Animal Crossing or whatever it is that's distracting us, watching TV. Did any of you play Animal Crossing? That was me trying to throw in a like, young people will know that. My daughter, okay, never mind then. It's a game that my daughter's playing. And she is, just so you don't think she's 3, she's 20, she just turned 20. All right, so yeah, get us away from our distractions and we can solve these problems usually, not always, but with enough time and effort and cooperation we can. So we'll leave it there because we're going to get into game theory. And let me just give you a teaser that we'll come back to on Thursday. But the game of Rochambeau, or rock, paper, scissors. Anybody not played that game? We've all played that game, right? So that's a perfect intro to game theory. It's actually a very difficult game to strategize about because it has no what we call dominant strategy. There's not one choice that always beats the others. It's all contextual, it's all relative. But But the game of rock, paper, scissors is you trying to predict what your opponent's going to choose. Once you predict your opponent's choice, then it's clear what your correct solution is, right? And that's exactly what we get with game theory. That's exactly like, all right, I'm the US. Should I stockpile nuclear weapons? Should I take some of my tax revenue, and instead of spending it on education or mission to Mars, should I spend it on bombs? That depends on what I think China's doing, right? How much should I try to clean up our plastic problem? That depends on what China's doing. Because if, right, this was the argument that the US actually used a couple decades ago. Well, a couple of times. We've done it in 2001. We did it recently a couple years ago. We basically said, hey, if China's not going to stop polluting, why should we? They're a bigger polluter than we are. So it makes no sense to impose discipline and costs on ourselves, right? Because it would be like a tax on plastic or a ban on plastic, or it would be a tax on carbon emitting things like gasoline. But if China's not going to do it, why would we take a hit and impose costs on ourselves when they're not doing it, right? So it is all about predicting what your opponent's going to do and then making the right play. But remember that there are times when China and US's, actually right now I would say China and US's mutual self-interest is to live in a world that has a future, right? That's not going to be bombed. And so we're doing two things, right? We're playing for our own self-interest, but we're also considering like future humanity. And that's what makes it interesting and tricky. And these are some of the biggest, coolest, and most complex problems in economics that people in your generation, I think, are going to have to be the ones to solve. But that's a good thing, because you're smart and more of you are interested in this stuff than my generation is, for sure. So let me end my portion there. Do you three have any questions for the moment? So I never got to ask you any questions because all my questions were about game theory, which we haven't started yet. So we'll do those questions on Thursday then. So I will post this for those of you, I guess you don't need to know because you're already watching it. You don't have to watch it again, but the rest of you will have watched this at home, and look forward to seeing you all, hopefully in person. It's so much better when we do it that way soon. So I'm going to say goodbye and stick around if you have any questions, but we'll end it there.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys.